Hello, everybody, and welcome to our 67 Palm Mall webinars. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's super exciting because after a year that has impacted South African wine industry, like no one other, it is so great to celebrate the spirit and the skill of the country's winemakers with a guided tasting of some of the country's finest and rarest wines ahead of its leading wine event in May 2021, the Cape Fine and Rare Wine Auction. Master of Wine and South Africa specialist Cathy is joined by Christie's auctioneer Charlie Foley and the Daily Telegraph's Victoria Moore for a sweep through a number of South Africa's finest wines and producers and a deep dive into the opportunity they present for collectors and wine enthusiasts alike. There will be a lot of things discussed tonight, including the vintages of 2009 and 2015 and the pioneering Old Vine project. So as usual, feel free to ask any questions. And if you do have questions, put them in a Q&A box so I can read it up to Charles, Victoria, and Cathy. If there's anything you'd like to share with us about the wines you're tasting tonight with us, or you have any thoughts on South African wines, feel free to chat outside. For now, I would love to welcome Charles, Victoria, and Cathy. I just have to unmute them so they can actually talk to all of you. I can see you, Charles.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening, Guyonard, and welcome to Collectable South Africa. I'm Charlie, specialist and auctioneer for Christie's and the Cape Fine and Rare Auction. Delighted to be here with Cathy and with Victoria to discuss what's in vogue in South Africa and everything involved in the Cape Fine and Rare Auction, which is happening on the 22nd of May in Stellenbosch this year. Apologies for my very loud jacket this evening. I texted my mother earlier, she said florals for spring, her original. So that's the look I'm going for. But of course it isn't spring in South Africa, it's autumn and the harvest is in. So after harvest, the producers will be looking forward to the Cape auction, as I said, happening in May in Stellenbosch. So what's the sale about? Well, it started as the Nederburg auction back in the 70s. And from there, it's grown not just to offer Nederburg wines now, but to offer wines from across South Africa. And it's the top wines, really, that are offered because they're picked by a selection panel, including the wonderful Cathy. And all of the wines that are picked go through into the sale, and then we offer them for sale. Why South Africa? Well, as Sophie said earlier, the COVID restrictions, unfortunately, have had a decimating toll on the industry in South Africa. And so really, really is the time to support South African wine. And the second reason is that the wines are flipping delicious, as Cathy will know because she has tasted all of them. So Cathy, let's hear a little bit about the selection process and how that's worked this year.
Good evening, everybody from South Africa. Charlie's apologizing about his jacket, which I think is great. They're not as great as the zebra striped jacket he wore at the auction the last time I saw him in South Africa. I must apologize for the quality of my rather old and trusty computer, but let's move on and talk about the selection process. So the Cape Fine and Rare Wine Auction is guided by two of those words in the title, fine and rare. So we try to look for wines on the one hand that could be fine and suitable for collection and nudge into that bracket of fine wines from around the world. And we certainly believe that we do have wines that can stand alongside some of the finest the rest of the wines world regions can offer. And then rare is a slightly more different interpretation. It comes in along with its strict interpretation that there will be rare offerings from people's cellars, wines that they might have kept back for a number of years, and in particular, Bergkelder and their Tabernacle do keep back wines from the 60s, 70s, and 80s that they release into this auction. But rare can also apply to, say, a wine from potentially a younger winemaker who may have made wine from a really good vineyard that is now being grubbed up and is not available anymore. So it might not have a lengthy provenance like some of the fine wines on offer, but it is definitely a rare wine and a wine worth having because it tells part of the South African story. For example, there was Radio Lazarus from Alheit Vineyards, Chris Alheit and his wife Suzanne. And 3 years into the drought, that vineyard, which was on a small hill with a radio tower at the top, just couldn't survive. It was there was no irrigation in the vineyard. We had not enough rain. Because it was on a slope, obviously, the moisture was dripping away through the soil rather than building up in the soil. And so the vineyard, unfortunately, died and they had to pull it out. So if we were to have some of that wine on auction, it would fall under the rare and fine, because Chris produces very much fine wines in his own right, as well as a couple of rare ones. The process is a relatively simple one. There's a panel of 4, myself, wine expert and industry guru, Michael Frijon, Francois Reitenbach, who is the wine buyer for Singita, and then Joseph Dufana, who is a sommelier and wine producer or brand owner in Cape Town. And what we do in the first round is have what we call the desktop tasting, and we go through the list of wines that have been submitted for auction, and we pick out the no-brainers. The Chris Alheit Radio Lazarus would be a no-brainer to fall into the fine and rare category. Klein Constantia van der Constance is another almost no-brainer, because it's made in such limited quantities and because they often release vintage stock from their cellar. And then we identify wines that we would like to taste. Potentially we think that they're very good and we know that they are very good, but we just want to check the provenance of those wines, and we call those wines into a tasting, and we taste every single one of those wines, and then on that day we select from that and add to our no-brainers. Horrible term to give wines, but it's tell them like you call them. You see?
I love that.
You see them.
Well done. And I also love the name Radio Lazarus, Cathy. That sounds like sort of a pirate radio station or something.
Oh yes, we're pirates in Africa. As you're going to have to explain to our tasters, Charlie, because we've pirated the wine tasting list, and we'll have to explain the new lineup to the people as we proceed.
Yeah, not a problem. We've decided tonight to taste French style, and that is red before white. We're doing that because there is a few whites with some residual sugar this evening for those of you who have the wines. So we're tasting the Cabernet Franc first, the Cabernet Sauvignon, then the dry Chenin, then the Sauvignon Semillon blend, and then the Riesling, and then the Botrytis Chenin. But Victoria, for you, why is South Africa on fleek now, and what's exciting about this auction?
I think all auctions are exciting of wine. It's a fantastic opportunity to buy wine that is a little bit more mature, to buy wine that you can't get on shelf. And it's a real, what for me is really exciting about Cape Fine and Rare is that it's a chance, it shines a spotlight on these very special wines. It really brings them to everyone's attention. And I have noticed over the last few years that South Africa really is riding a kind of crest of a wave. I know a lot of people who previously you would have considered they would be claret only drinkers or burgundy only drinkers. Suddenly they're dipping their toes in South Africa. They're wanting to visit there. They're wanting to talk about producers. They're wanting to buy the wines. So I think there is a real excitement and interest at the moment. I was quite curious to find out how much of a secondary market there was for South African wines already, because obviously this auction it's a bit of a one-off. It's a very special chance. It curates the wines beautifully and it displays them so that we can all see what treasures South Africa has. And I discovered that I had a bit of a dig around. I had a look on BBX, the Berry Brothers Broking Exchange, and I found that they are actually turning over, their members are selling around 500 cases of South African wine a year. I dug through it and there are about 50 or so South African listings, quite a lot of chocolate block, the Cloudy Bay of South Africa. As you might expect, quite a lot of Van der Constance, a lot of Eben Sadi, but there is definitely this sense that there is a growing momentum. I also spoke to LiveX, who sent me a brilliant chart showing me the number of data points that they had amassed every year. And every year it's going up, 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 which is really just showing us that there is an ever increasing amount of activity in this market. They did say, is there an emerging secondary market? Perhaps it's a bit too early to draw strong conclusions from the data, but I think that we can certainly see that people are buying, people are looking. And more recently, Tim Atkin gave the Cannon Cop Paul Sour 2015 100 points, and its value shot up. I noticed that it was turning over on wine owners for £220 a bottle. So we're seeing these different effects. We're seeing some critics effects, and we're seeing, I think, a kind of halo effect from the wines that have traditionally been perhaps the best known that South Africa has, and it's beginning to spread across many other wines now. So I think it's all very exciting.
Perfect, thank you. And the Paul Sour point's interesting because I remember 2 years ago, the first wine we sold was 1995 Paul Sour. And I think it was selling for about 40 or 50 pounds a bottle. That was the reserve anyway. And I mean, you can't get the 95 anywhere in the UK or even European market now. But the 94 is selling for about 130 pounds. So, you know, if there's any reason to get involved in the South African, this auction, is that you can find these wines that you can't find anywhere else. It's, you know, they're just so rare. Perfect. Well, that's the introduction to the sale. And so we're going to share a little bit of knowledge about South Africa as we riff over these wines. And as I said, we've changed up the order, and we're starting, excitingly, with a Cabernet Franc. And this is from a producer called Rats. Hopefully I get the pronunciation right. Cathy can correct me if I don't. But Cabernet Franc from South Africa is a rarity. And as I understand it, this producer only makes one red wine. And so I'm wondering, is it sort of a Loire style or a Bordeaux style? Cathy, what's your opinion on this?
This is definitely more in the Bordeaux style. It's got a lot more concentration and a lot more tannin structure than we'd expect from a Loire example. And just to tell you that Robert Rats, who is the founder of this domain and who still makes the wine together with his cousin, he does have one other red wine, not in, it's called the Mvemvi Rats, and that is a Bordeaux blend that he made with a friend of his, Mzo Mvemvi, who now I think is studying for his MBA, and he's not so involved in the winery before, but it was one of the first joint ventures between a white winemaker and a black wine lover come winemaker. But to move on to the Cabernet Franc, Breuvert is, how could we absolutely bonkers about Cabernet Franc. And yes, under his Rats label, he does only make Cabernet Franc wines. This one is from vines that he originally are in Stellenbosch, some of his own plantings and some fruit that he buys in. The average age is between 18 and 25 years, so not quite an old vine vineyard yet, which we'll get to a little bit later. But he harvests at only about 6 to 7 tons a hectare, which is about average in South Africa. And he really strives for a lovely ripeness of fruit. One thing you will always pick up on South Africa Cabernet Franc is that they do, I think, have a little bit more of that herby edge than you sometimes get in Bordeaux Cabernet Francs. But I really enjoy the tannin structure on this wine.
Absolutely delicious, and full of that sort of pencil shaving note that you always get with Cab Franc, which I think is really gorgeous. And Victoria, for you, how did you find the wine? And intriguing to hear Cathy talk about the balance of white and red as for this producer in South Africa at large.
I was completely blown away by this. There's always that slight moment of nerves when I taste any wine, and this one just made me go, oh, it's all there. It has, as Cathy said, the concentration is really fantastic, but sometimes with Cabernet Franc, you find that concentration comes with a kind of lack of detail, but this, it's got almost mosaic detail. It's beautifully delineated all the way through. The fragrance is incredibly attractive. It really flows out of the glass. And yes, you have the herbaceous notes there, absolutely. I feel also as if Cabernet Franc is becoming increasingly valued, certainly amongst winemakers, perhaps also a little bit amongst wine drinkers around the world. You know, it's the darling of Bulgari now in Italy, where super Tuscan country. It's obviously its homeland might be said to be in the Loire, but it's becoming so much more appreciated, I think, in Bordeaux as well, and in Argentina too. They're making some beautiful Cabernet Francs. I remember tasting Cabernet Franc for the first in South Africa with Breuvert Rats many years ago, and he's so inspiring when he talks about the grape. His passion for it really comes through, and you find yourself hanging on his every word. It's a really, really exciting wine. I think also I find that a lot of my readers often tend to think of South Africa as a red wine producing country. And you asked that question, and it's only recently that the balance has tipped to be more or less even. There's still slightly more white wine produced in South Africa than red. It stands at about 55% white wine today. In the 90s, it was, I think, 18% red only. So there has been a real shift in the balance. So we're enjoying these red wines now. We've got another one coming up, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll go to the next grape variety, which is the grape variety that South Africa hangs its hat on, really, Cabernet Sauvignon. And this is from Le Riche, and it's an older vintage, 2009. We're looking at these two great vintages for South Africa this evening. So Le Riche is a member of the Cabernet Collective. And I think this is, so typical of Cabernet Sauvignon. It has that wonderful structure, that wonderful verve, and that sort of nice wall of tannin. Cathy, how did you find this wine? I know you're drinking it out of bottle, not out of little taster.
Oh yes, I have big bottles with me. That's one of the perks of living in the country where the wine is produced. So Le Riche is a father and son team with this wine would have been made probably more by the father, Etienne Le Riche, who was the winemaker for many years at Rustenburg, and in fact made the first dry reds, which were predominantly cab in the 1970s, and then moved on to making the Rustenburg Cabernet Sauvignon when it was bottled as a single variety. So a lot of history there. And Etienne and his son Christo really know the vineyards around Stellenbosch, and they don't own many vineyards of their own. So this is actually a blend from the wards in Stellenbosch of Jonkershoek and Furgrove. So two quite different wards, probably about 20 kilometers apart. Furgrove much closer to the sea and more open to wind influence, whereas Jonkershoek is a narrower valley with slightly more elevated vineyards. I've just had the privilege of tasting all the 2017 vintages for the Stellenbosch Cabernet Collective for all of their members. And I must say that there are a number of gems in that, in the collective. And Le Riche has got wines on auction by himself, but there are a couple, I think there are 2, maybe 3 lots from the Cabernet Collective in the auction this year. So if you think you're going to want to take a journey around Stellenbosch Cabernet and get to understand it and get to grips with it, maybe putting one of those cases of the Stellenbosch Cab Collective on your checklist is a good idea to do, Charlie.
Perfect. Sign me up. I love a journey through Cabernet. I'll sink in
it. What I would like to point out is the RS on this wine. It's only 1.8 grams per litre. And one of the criticisms of South African reds in the recent past has been that we tend to pack too much sunshine into our wines. But I think this wine shows great restraint. Yes, it does have a little bit of that fruitiness, which is what we love from the Southern Hemisphere, but we don't want too much sweetness. And this has pulled it back really nicely for me.
Absolutely, I agree. It's sort of a glossy wine, which you often find in sort of the great French chateau. So it really has that. Maybe this is a good moment, Cathy, just to talk about the last year, how it's been in South Africa for winemakers. I don't know if groups like the Cabernet Collective are holding things together rather than producers feeling isolated. COVID's obviously had a horrible effect there. So maybe you have some on-the-ground knowledge about that.
Well, yes. In more ways than one, COVID hit us for a 6. Sorry, it seems my dog is going to join me here for the tasting, because we've been through 3 alcohol bans. And I was really very jealous speaking to friends of mine on webinars on a Friday morning. Just we'd have this catch up and people would hear the doorbell go and they'd say, so sorry, that's my collection of wine coming in, or so sorry, that's my collection of plants from the nursery. And we couldn't buy wine. It was banned. So they literally, in our highest level of lockdown, banned the transport of alcohol, full stop. And that had a major impact on exports because obviously producers couldn't get wines from the producing cellar through to the docks to be loaded onto the ships. So we had, I think it was 7 weeks of no exports before we were able to convince the government to change the legislation to allow us to transport wine for export. And we had nearly 12 weeks of no alcohol whatsoever. Fortunately, I have a cellar, but I know lots of people went without wine for a long time. And then we just gotten over that when we had another one. So it was 2 last year. And then, believe it or not, the government took away alcohol from us for New Year. We understand all the reasons why they did that, the health reasons for doing that, but it did put a tremendous strain on the producers. You know, once that ship sailed from harbour without your wine on board, you'd lost a whole tank, a whole container full of exports, and you couldn't really get those sales back. You know, you couldn't tell the restaurant or the importer in Japan that, don't worry, you'll send some more wine in a month or 2, because the opportunity was lost. But importantly as well, it had a major social impact, because for a number of wineries, not getting that container onto the ship meant that they weren't getting cash flow into their bank account. So a container, I think it was Caroline Martin from Creation said that they had a container of wine waiting to go, and that container represented a whole month's cash flow for the winery. And so you can imagine that wine farmers were struggling to pay workers. They rely on cash flow as much as any other business. It's quite a capital intensive and quite a cash flow intensive business.
Absolutely.
And another impact of that very first lockdown was that it happened before our harvest was finished, our 2020 harvest was finished. So you had, in some instances, grape growers sending teams into the vineyards, but wine industry wasn't classified as an essential service. And so the workers was not supposed to be in the vineyards picking fruit. So that fortunately only took about 3 or 4 days to get sorted out, but it did impact a couple of grape growers quite substantially.
Thank you. It's absolutely horrendous. My heart goes out to all of the producers.
It's really, and yeah, it's been a big conundrum, because I have to say, I know a couple of people whom it turned into bootleggers because they had to put food on the table, money in the bank, and pay workers as well as keep their families fed. So
absolutely. But Victoria, just to head towards the UK, maybe you have a view on how the UK has sort of helped. I mean, you know, shout out to Waitrose with all of their offers on South African wine. I know there's a few more things coming through, but you know, buying at the top end at this auction is the way to help producers at the moment. Maybe you have a view on that, Victoria.
Certainly, I spoke to a lot of producers last summer who didn't even know whether their wine was on a ship, whether it was still stuck in port, and they often didn't know till it actually landed, till it arrived. I was incredibly impressed by the phlegmatic and stoic attitude that everybody seemed to have towards this, because it was obviously a very desperate situation for some, and people were simply putting a brave face on it. But yes, a lot of the retailers, as you say, shout out to Waitrose, they've done their best to try and put the South African wine when it was in the country, to try and encourage people to buy it, to create special South African offers. There's a new, in fact, one of the things that has come out of the lockdown is a new initiative that landed in my inbox this morning between Waitrose and Molyneux and Lieu, who've started a new brand together with the workers. So it is owned by the workers on the estate, and they will receive the profits from it. So that's one of the initiatives that's come out of the very difficult year that everyone's had, and I think it's a great idea.
It's called Great Heart. Yes.
Great Heart. That's right. Yeah.
Fantastic. And it feeds into all of the diversity and sustainability, you know, questions that are surrounding the wine trade at the moment. So it's fantastic, and you know, the way to support the premium producers in their quest for more premiumization is to show interest in their wines that they offer through this auction and other retailers. So let's move away from red then. There are 2 delicious reds, but we've got a host of whites here. And so let's go to the first of the white varietals, which is the white variety that South Africa hangs its hat on. It is, of course, Chenin Blanc. And this is from Waterford Estate. I tasted this just now. I think this is really, really delicious Chenin. It's properly high acidity. really dry. Cathy, what do you think about this wine showing this evening?
Actually had a sip yet.
She doesn't know what she thinks.
Well,
I'll tell you what you think.
I had this wine with Kevin Arnold at the properly socially distanced 2 weeks ago, and I have to show it's showing as nicely here tonight in my rather brightly lit office as it did sitting under the plane trees in the beautiful but deserted Waterford courtyard. One other table aside from me there, because obviously COVID has a major impact on our wine tourism industry as well. This wine is part of the Old Vines lot that is coming up. So Waterford, not usually a state known for Chenin Blanc, more for Chardonnay and for their red wines. But this certainly for me, Charlie, is showing really beautifully as a Chenin, but also as an old vine Chenin.
There's incredible concentration.
It's got lovely concentration, which Risa Kruger, who started the Old Vines Initiative, likes to say is what the old vines give to it. And it's also though showing that lovely white peach that I always get on a Stellenbosch Chenin.
Absolutely. And for you, Cathy, what is the definition of old vines for you, and why are they so special in South Africa?
Well, I think they're special around the world, but I did write down something that Risa said about old vines here. And she says that she asked herself in this piece, do old vines make better wines? And she said she believes they do. And I also believe they do. I think that they impart more of a sense of place to a wine than younger vines do. They have a lovely density, and they tend to get their complexity from layers as opposed to just aromatic complexity. So for me, a number of old vines that you taste, and there's quite a number of them that are on the auction as well in single lots. I think they're of the David and Nadi Hoorstein and Skali Corp, which are old vine vineyards from the Swartland. They're not always that expressive on the nose unless you sit with them for an hour or so, but they always exhibit this beautiful density and concentration. And the one thing that I love about old vines, I visited with Andrea and Chris Molyneux, one of the old vine vineyards that they were rehabilitating. And Risa was in the vineyard with the team that she was training up to take care of this vineyard for the Molyneux. And she showed me one of these old bush vines, and she said, Cathy, you won't believe it. This is now our 4th year of drought. And she says, this old vine has orientated itself differently to make sure that it is protected from the harsh sun in the morning and from the setting sun in the afternoon. She says it's very subtle, and you'll only know it if you walk past and live in the vineyard like I do and get to know each of these vines. But the old vines, they've got a history. It's like me and my muscle memory when I have to do yoga and I'm not paying attention and suddenly find I'm doing the downward dog even though I thought I was doing something else. But these old vines have a memory, and they remember how to cope with the seasons, and they know how to cope far better. And that's also borne out by some of the producers in the Swartland who planted new vines, unfortunately, just before the drought. And they said that once those young vines had lived through drought for 2 seasons, they seemed to know what to do the next season and the next season. So I find them fascinating.
Oh, that's amazing. I'll forever remember now Chenin Blanc from South Africa as the yoga of wine. That's going to be my rattling around in my head. And Rosa, of course, working with Andre, who I met 2 years ago, that man has the most powerful handshake. You know, he's absolutely bone crushing. I'm fairly limp-wristed anyway, so for me, it was terrible. But Victoria, maybe this is a moment to talk about sort of the sustainability of South African wine in relation to old vines, and because I think what Cathy said there, it lent nicely to sustainability.
Even before I do that, I wrote down the same quote as Cathy of Rosa Kruger's, and it went on so lyrically. I just wanted to read a little bit more of it out because it's really beautiful. She said, "Age in vines brings an intensity, a perceived freshness, a texture, and a sense of place. They show less fresh fruit and varietal character and more terroir and soil. They remind me of our land, the cold late afternoon winds on the hills behind Lambert's Bay on the west coast, the smell of kelp and seashells, the sense of space and colour driving past fields of yellow canola." She goes on, but it's absolutely beautiful, and I think this is true. And why is it so important to save the old vines? Well, because when the vines are old, they produce less fruit, so yields were low. So many of the grapes from these old vines were simply going into cooperative wines before the Old Vine Project started, and they were not earning the farmers who worked the land enough money, so they were all in danger of being pulled out. So I think what this work has done is incredibly important, because by making wines simply made from the old vines, it has enabled the vineyards to stay in place rather than being uprooted and replaced with something that can earn the farmer more money. So there is a sort of a keeping the land in good condition, keeping the old things there, a really important part of that. But South Africa, people are often surprised to hear, has been doing sustainability and thinking about sustainability and working on sustainability long before that became such a buzzword. With New Zealand, the wine industry has been one of the leading countries in the whole world. They began their sustainability program way back in 1998. And since then, it has grown and grown. I think something like 95% of producers and growers stick to the sustainability regulations. So it has really taken off. And it's incredible, really, to think that's been going nearly 25 years. I feel as if the rest of us caught on maybe 5 years ago, but South Africa was there, looking after the Cape Floral Kingdom, improving workers' rights, investing in education, just moving everything forward, taking care of water. So when you buy a South African wine, you can look for the sustainability seal and know that people are working hard on it. And I think to visit the country is to be really amazed and impressed by how many people are thinking about things other than just making the wine. You visit Paul Kluwer in Elgin, and they're investing heavily and have done for a long time in education. You walk up onto the hillside and you see how much work has been done there to look after conservation work, to look after the land. And nobody really is thinking just in terms of producing a wine. Everybody has a wider vision. And it's always the thing that moves me most, I think, when I visit South Africa, just how much everyone is doing.
Fantastic. The Rainbow Nation ahead of the international game. I love it. And you're great at rugby too. So, and
Charlie, can I
talk about the proof tag, is it?
See here on my bottle, they won't obviously have got it. Going back to seals, when you said the word seal, Victoria, I was looking to see if I could find. So here, this one is the Waterford, and it's got the Old Vines seal that members can place on the bottle, and that certifies that it's made from vineyards 35 years and older. That's our definition of old vines, is 35 years and older. And South Africa was actually the first in the world to have this and put it on a bottle. Many other countries claim old vines or Ville, but they don't actually have the legislation to support it. And then here, if I can show you without pouring Shannon all over my is the biodiversity and sustainability sticker as well.
I love that. That's fantastic. That's great. And I just wanted to quickly mention about the collectability of Chenin Blanc, because we've mentioned David and Nadia's wines, but the 2015 was sold 2 years ago, and I think we're selling for about 1,000 rand, which is equivalent to about sort of £50. But you can't find the 2015 David and Nadia Hosteen anywhere in the world now. It's not available on Wine Searcher or in any retailer. And another one I love is Al Heights Magnetic North. That was selling for about the same price. Well, you can't find the 2015 in the UK. You can find it in Japan, where it's £70, and you can find it in Switzerland, where it's £90. Granted, in Switzerland, £90 is the price of a cup of coffee, but it just goes to show that it was selling for 50, and it's double the price now. So these collectible Chenins are really the thing to look out for. let's switch through to another wine then. This is a wine I really love. It's GVB, but it's actually a Sauvignon Semillon blend from Vergelegen. And the Semillon has been aged in new oak, I think, and the Sauvignon hasn't. But for me, this is quite Baudelaire style, don't you think, Cathy?
Absolutely. This the GVB on this stands for grown, vinified, and bottled, which attests to the fact that Vergelegen owns all its vineyards. It farms its own vineyards, it picks its own grapes, and it vinifies them and bottles them on the property. And the reason why that is so important to winemaker Andre van Rensburg. And if we could have another hour and a half, I could regale everybody with stories about Andre van Rensburg and his outspoken nature. But Andre really believes in Vergelegen as a place. I remember saying to him one year, about 10 years ago, when he was bottling his flagship red. And I said, but Andre, this is a really bad vintage. A couple of other estates in Stellenbosch are declassifying from their so-called Grand Van and just blending it into their second wines. And he said, don't be silly, Cathy, you can't do that. If you're a custodian of a property, you have a responsibility to reflect that property and its terroir and the vintage in the bottle each and every year. So we will bottle regardless, because we want to tell the entire story of this estate, not just the story when it suits us. So that's why we have grown, vinified, and bottled, because Andre is so passionate about it. And yes, he is actually a Baudelaire fan himself. Loves Merlot, doesn't seem to be able to get it right in his opinion. But his white blend, for me, is one of the flagships of the South African industry and does show exactly how good South Africa is with white blends. But we haven't spoken about what categories I think the country's strongest in. If I can mention that, white blends, either Bordeaux in style, or as we call them, Mediterranean. Though the Loire and Chenin is about as far from the Mediterranean as you can get, but they're often blended with Viognier and Marsanne and Roussanne, which are slightly closer. So a beautiful wine. It's also got quite a lot of, it's quite a cool area, quite close to False Bay, so it gets impacted by the southeaster. But it's got that almost that oyster shell and Grave-like character that I love so much.
Beautiful, and a contrast to the sort of Sauvignons from Constantia, which tend to have the more pyrazine notes and more grass and asparagus things.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Fantastic, Victoria. What are your feelings about this wine? Did you like it?
There's a lovely waxiness to this wine, isn't there? And it's got that very slight pine nose that you pine tree, pine needles. So it really sits with the kind of slightly vegetal note, but it's got the warmth as well. I think that many of my readers will probably be familiar with Vergelegen as an amazing picnic spot.
Oh, yeah.
It's one of the wineries in South Africa that is really on the tourist trail and has been for a long, long time. And I wanted to talk a little bit about how important that has been to South Africa's presence in the UK and around the world. I know that many, many wine regions offer tourism opportunities, but I feel that South Africa does it in a unique way. If you encounter anybody who's going to visit Cape Town, they will usually have a tick list, and that will usually include visit Cape Point, climb up Table Mountain, and it will also include going to visit some wine producers, tasting at some cellar doors, and driving off and using those locations as a way to explore the landscape. And every single person I spoke to recently, researching to do this panel discussion, mentioned tourism as one of the reasons for South Africa's success. I know that many English producers are trying to emulate it, but for me, it's been the most successful thing they've done. It creates lifelong South African wine fanatics. I know that tourism is worth about 15% of the turnover of most of South African cellars, but I think that it's worth even more than that in terms of how often it sends people back and back and back to taste the wines. People go to South Africa once on honeymoon, 30 years later, they're still saying, yes. They're still looking, they're still interested. I think they feel like they have this personal connection. And I think that really importantly, it connects people to the landscape as well as to the wines. So it's not just about having a nice memory, it's about remembering where places are, it's about remembering the experience, it's about remembering the landscape. And that ties again into the old vine wines that we're seeing now, these small parcels of vines that come from different places around the Cape. People look at those labels and they remember driving near those places. They remember going there. And people generally, I find their geography isn't particularly amazing when it comes to talking wine regions. But when you talk about South Africa, people will say, oh yes, Stellenbosch this, oh yes, Franschhoek this, and they have it in their heads. So it has been a vital part of the resurgence, really, of the wine industry.
Absolutely. So true. It's amazing. Yeah, thank you for those words. And what I wouldn't give to be in Delair Graff's restaurant right now with the view down over the Helderberg. I love that place. Perhaps before we move on to the wines with a bit of residual sugar, we'll just talk, Cathy, if we can, about these two vintages, the 2009 and the 2015, and how big they are for South African wine. David's just written a little question there. Has there been a vintage since 15 that you think will be up there with 09 and 15? Has the drought and fires been more localized? I know 11, the big drought vintage, but why are there so many of these wonderful vintages in the auction? Did you just love them?
The 2009 and 2015 are almost complete opposites of each other. So of the 2009, they say that in 2009, it wasn't a case of the whites being as good as 1997 or the reds being on a par kind of with 1995 or 2000. In 2009, it was just that both reds and whites performed so exceptionally well. And this year was quite a late year. The winter was for us relatively cold. We had plenty of rain, and that coolness persisted into the budding and flowering season, so much so that it actually brought the crop down a little bit, and it particularly impacted those vintages, those grapes which are early ripening, because they obviously would be budding and fruit setting earlier than the others. However, it then just warmed up gently, but we never had any of those heat waves that we can sometimes get in February, and kept on being cool into March, and just produced whites with complete elegance, and reds with good weight and good tannin structure, but none of that overwhelming sometimes concentration that you can get when a grape has gone through a rapid heat wave ripening period. And then by contrast, the 2015 was one of the driest and earliest on record. And obviously if it's dry, you don't get much rot at all in the vineyards. So it was very clean, very disease-free, and the grapes ripened smoothly, evenly. The winemakers knew what was coming. They knew how to handle it. They didn't have to rush anything through tanks or rush anything into barrel. So that was another great harvest, but for different reasons, and which I think goes to illustrate that you can't always lump together. I know the tendency is from a lot of people to just lump together in South Africa. The vintage for this year is great, and then expect the wine from all the different regions together. But if you have been like those honeymooners from 30 years ago who traveled through South Africa, you know how many mountains we've got, you know how many aspects we've got, and mountains can block rain and keep it in some areas, and keep other areas dry. Cloud cover in Elgin can do different things to the temperature that we have in summers in Stellenbosch, where the wind is pushing the clouds away. So we do have great vintage variation throughout the whole country, but just on a whole, 2009 and 2015, for different reasons, were very good. I like the 2017 vintage. So I think it's coming out of the drought years. But still, the vines by this stage had learned to cope with most of the drought, and also quite a clean year, not much disease pressure, and easy to handle in the cellar. So I like the 2017. Watch out for that in a few years.
Fantastic. Look forward to tasting them as soon as possible. And just quickly about old vintages, because the sale originated from the Nederburg, and so look out for some vintages older than me. There's some from the 70s there, and the 1980 vintage from Chateau Libertas, Zonnebloem, and the Nederburg Bin series, of course. So look out for those in the sale. They all have the acidity, the tannin, and the longevity to age for a long time. So they're worth looking out for. That's a little chat about vintages, and we'll, because we've got 10 minutes left, move to some wines with residual sugar. The first of which is a Riesling, and I think this has about 10 grams of residual sugar. But I think it's just delicious, absolutely exquisite. And Victoria, maybe you have a bit of insight on sort of minority grapes like Riesling, which South Africa isn't famous for, but at higher altitude sites they have a fair bit.
Well, Riesling amazingly is South Africa's 32nd most planted variety.
Really?
It comes a really long way down the list. And yet one can immediately think of a few. We've talked about Paul Kluwer already, beautiful Rieslings there. This is Thelema, and it's so bright and so sharp on the nose and so arrow-like in the way it comes out of the glass, and it wears its residual sugar really beautifully. And I think this, for me, this works incredibly well, and South Africa should be better known for Riesling if it can make such good Riesling as that. I think that the tendency to make wine now by roving winemakers who go around and they look for plots of land, they rifle through Rosa Kruger's old vine register. I had a little look at that online, and I almost began to want to make wines myself. You can actually see what's available. You can look through and you can see a parcel of this many vines here in this area, and you can select them and buy them and off you go. But I think that has really helped to bring to the fore some of South Africa's lesser known grape varieties, or the grape varieties that are not planted in such great numbers, because you have somebody like Blank Bottle, for example, is a good example, making dozens and dozens of wines every year, not necessarily ever making them again. So many different wines, but able to make beautiful wines from grapes that we might not even have heard of in other countries, at least not unless you're very into wine. I remember tasting my first ever neat claret, a Rhone variety grown in Swartland. And I was over there for the Swartland Revolution one year and was being given components of these white blends. And I smelt it and I thought, this is just beautiful. It's such a gorgeous wine. It was really the first time I tried it on its own, that lovely waxy white flower smell. And it was really, really doing so well. I also really like South African Sanso, white Grenache, the beautiful texture again you get in a white Grenache, that kind of pom-pom feeling and layers of flavor. It's a really expressive grape, and it's not so much about, it's not the fruit bowl of flavors. When you're trying to describe it, it's quite difficult because you don't want to really pick words like peachy or floral. You just want to talk about the way it feels in the mouth. And Marsanne, red Grenache, there's surprisingly little red Grenache in South Africa. But I think we see all these being celebrated now in wines that winemakers who've made their reputation perhaps with a grape that's better known, like Chenin Blanc, then pull them out and bring them to the fore.
Absolutely, yeah. And maybe one of the key themes there that was quite interesting, Cathy, and if you could expound on that, is that South Africa used to be known for, being dominated by production by, cooperatives like KWV and these sort of things. But what the Cape Fine and Rare celebrates is independent winemakers in the main. There's lots more independent winemakers now. And how has that sort of come about in the last 10 years?
Oh, we don't have that much time to talk about that.
Yeah.
But, in a nutshell, yes, the KWV used to have the power to tell people where they could plant and what they could plant. So, for example, in the 1970s, the Hemelanada didn't exist, for example, or wine growing areas stopped at the bottom of Solaris Pass before you climb up into Elgin to get there. And then slowly but surely the KWV's powers were taken away, but we do have to thank the KWV for a lot of things, least not of all their virus program, but that's for discussion of another thing. But since then, I've been chatting to Neil Ellis and a couple of other people, and people tend to forget how young the modern South African winemaking area is, because in the 1970s, even you spoke about Kanonkop, for example, prior to 1970, they were growing grapes, but they had to make the wine and then sell it to Stellenbosch Farmers Winery, who then would bottle it and put it into brands. And then with the 1973 vintage, Johan Kricke's father and the then winemaker, Jan Boerland, decided that they were going to keep some wine back and they were going to bottle it themselves as Kanonkop and sell it. And that 1973 Cabernet Sauvignon, which was off, I think, only 4-year-old vines, was one of the most celebrated Cabernet Sauvignons in South Africa. So that's really when the producers went back, or the wines farm owners went back and started making wines and bottling them on their own. And just some figures, in the latest figures that I've got out of the 2019 Sarvis booklet says that there are currently 460 private producer sellers. So that would be your Vergelegens, but then also people like your Chris Alheids and your Eben Sadis. And of those 460, 214 crush less than 100 tons, and 149 crush between 100 to 500 tons. So that's 365. That's almost a full 3/4 of the private sellers are crushing less than 500 tons. And they really play a vital role in the South African industry, because they are generating the excitement. They are increasing quality by pushing the quality bar, and they're just delightful to watch, because there's always something new coming out of a private producer seller.
Absolutely, I can testament to the innovation and the celebrity of those things was 2 years ago when we sold the last lot of the sale. That was Eben Sadi's Columella, and the 12 bottles and then the 12 magnums of vintages going back to 2001. And the sensation in the room, there's such excitement because there was vintages on offer there all the way back to 2001. And you can't get the 2001 now. It's just the 06 is the latest vintage you can get. And the room exploded. It was so fun. So we're looking forward to recreate some of that in May this year. Just because we have 5 minutes left, we'll go to the last wine, and thank God we've saved this to last, because there's tons of sugar in this, isn't there? And I'm in love with it. You know, this is taking me straight to the Loire. It's the Fleur de Cap Chenin Blanc 2009. Victoria, how did you find this?
I've literally only just tasted it because I was nervous about the sugar and tasting it earlier. And it's got a lovely aromatic nose, beautiful florals, a little bit of barley sugar on it. And then you go into the sweetness, but there's a lovely refreshing acidity washing through afterwards as well. It's really impressive.
Absolutely. Cathy, how much sugar is in this? Do you know the detail?
Yes, I can tell you. 243.5 grams.
Wow, that is sweet then, isn't it? I'll take my teeth off. I'll go and get a tart tatin or something afterwards to have with this.
Total acidity, 10.8. And
Fantastic.
alcohol, only 9.59%.
Yeah.
From Chenin Blanc, and quite a lot of botrytis, approximately 60 to 70% botrytis. And I think you can pick that up not only in the concentrated acidity, but in that lovely almond character, apricot character.
Absolutely. But the famous wines of South Africa are not actually botrytis, are they? Because Grand Constance and Klein Constantius Vin de Constance are a late harvest. Correct me if I'm wrong, is that right?
Correct, yeah.
Okay.
And actually in Klein Constantius' case, Van de Passelerage, sorry for my French accent.
Straw wine.
Yeah, the dried on the vine, as opposed to straw wine dried on the mat.
Yeah.
So
perfect.
But I mean, Fleur de Cap does this really, really well. And of course, South Africa's first Noble Late harvest was Edelclear, and it was also made from a Chenin.
Fantastic. I love it. It's great. And you really need a dessert with this. So it'll send me off to bed nicely this evening. So that's all of the wines. We have dashed through all of those and riffed over some South African points. So we look forward to the sale on the 22nd of May. Maybe, Victoria, if you've had a sort of flick through, what would be your big pick for the auction on what excites you for South Africa? What would you go for if you were signing up to bid?
I would definitely be going for that Raats Cabernet Franc. It knocked me over when I first smelt it. It just comes out of the glass. It still has it still feels very young, and it's got so much fragrance. I think you would want to try this.
Great, thank you. And for you, Cathy, having tasted all of the wines in the auction, what for you is let's stick to one. But what would you really want to take home on a Sunday afternoon?
You can't ask me to stick to one.
I'm doing it.
That's just not fair. I mean, I think if I win the lottery next week, I'd probably go out and buy some of the 2009 Canon Paul Sour. I must just say that both the winemaker of that wine and Andre van Rensburg at Vergelegen are the only two people in South Africa ever to win the main Madame de Lancassang's trophy for the best red wine in the world. And they both won it twice. And then I would also get the 1980, 1982, 1984 Chateau Libertas, just to tip my hat to some oldies. And then to satisfy my Shannon craving, I'd buy David and Nadia Schalikop and Hoorstein. They've got 2015 on the auction this year.
Fantastic, very rare thing indeed.
So those are just three that I would pick.
Good that you kept it to three. Magic number, the number of three. And for me, I'm obviously excited with the anything which overperforms in the sale. 2 years ago, the Villafonte Series 3 did exceptionally well. In I always like a big format bottle. I like a party, you know that. So I liked that. And I shout out to some producers who I quite like. Lismore, they make a great Viognier, and Syrah. I really love their wines. And I quite like the wines of Luddite because I've tasted them recently and they're really fantastic. I love what they're doing at that state. The ethos and the philosophy of the winemaking is so great. And they're sort of edging towards the low sulfur thing, aren't they, Cathy? What's your view of the low sulfur? It's big thing there.
No, they definitely are. In fact, there's I'm always surprised when I do tasting for Platter at how many wineries in South Africa actually bottle it well below the maximum allowed sulfur levels, because we ask them to disclose sulfur on the TAs that they submit for us.
Fantastic. I mean, I think that's happening all around the world now. The lower sulfur is a trend, and another one that's always quite intriguing is whole cluster. I don't know if that's happening much in South Africa. I haven't tasted many. Yeah.
You're not a proper winemaker if you know.
I love it. That's a quote of the day. Fantastic. Well, I hope everybody enjoyed all of the wines. We're exactly 9 o'clock. With Cathy, it's 10 o'clock there, so it's just time for a big slug of your Botrytis wine. And so if anybody has any quick questions or anything, we're happy to answer them, or I'm sure everybody wants to take a glass of the Fleur de Cap and swing their way to bed gently. But before you all go, we look forward to seeing you online. It's the first time that the sale has been streamed live on the 22nd of May from the Rupert's Museum in Stellenbosch. Reasons to tune in. Obviously, the wines are delicious, and there's plenty more to see in the catalogue when it comes out next in a few weeks' time. Also tune in because I promised to wear a suit that is absolutely perfect. I'm replacing the E with a U, so tune in to find out more. You can register as a bidder at capefinerareWine.auction, or let me know via Instagram, c.t.foley. I'm happy to help you. Thank you very much, Victoria and Cathy. It's been a wonderful evening. Fantastic wines. Any last words?
Please take out your pounds and buy some wines. It's actually very cheap when you convert it to pounds to rands. And just enjoy South African wine, even if you can't get to the auction. Support us through the retailers. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Cathy.
Thank you very much for all of you to join. Victoria, Cathy, and Charles, it was amazing. It was fascinating to listen to you. I think we're going to have a lot of bidders. There's a lot of people watching and was watching. So I hope you will. And as Palma, we have been big supporters of South African wines. throughout the last year, and we do love South African wine. So yes, please bid and support South African
Thanks,
wine
Sophie. We look
industry.
forward to being back drinking a glass with you in Pall Mall.
Well, you shall in a
soon.
month. What is it? A month and a half
month.
time? You will be able to do
Perfect.
that.
Perfect.
Come and join us. Have a lovely night.
Perfect. Happy Monday, everybody. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.